Rain pours over a busy Lagos street. Horns blare. People run for shelter. But one pregnant woman stands helpless, soaked to the bone, carrying a heavy nylon bag, trembling. He was driving past when he saw her. A pregnant woman under the rain, no umbrella, no shoes, no help. Something in him said stop. But what he didn't know was that the woman he helped was the same one he abandoned after a night that changed both their lives forever. 3 years earlier, Chaka, a wealthy Nigerian tech billionaire, had a wild night at his hotel suite during a business conference in Enugu. Among the invited staff was Ezen, a beautiful but shy caterer who only came to deliver small chops. Somehow, through manipulation and alcohol, Chaka lured her into his room. The next morning, he was gone. No phone number. No apology. Nothing. Ezen returned home to her village under the weight of heartbreak and humiliation. Carrying more than just a swollen belly, she carried shame, pain, and unanswered questions. The once vibrant girl who had left for Enugu with dreams and dignity came back with her eyes dimmed and her spirit shattered. The compound where she had grown up, once filled with laughter and evening songs from the nearby church, now felt cold and hostile. Her mother, a proud widow known for her strict Christian values, was the first to confront her. Ezen had barely stepped into the yard when the judgment came. There were no arms to embrace her, no comforting words, only cold eyes filled with anger and disappointment. The moment the villagers heard she had returned, whispers began to float from one hut to another. She went to the city and came back with pregnancy and no husband. Another girl lost to city life. Even the women who once complimented her beauty now shook their heads in pity or disgust. To them, she had become a disgrace, a lesson for their own daughters. Her mother didn't bother asking what happened. She didn't want to hear excuses. She had raised Ezen in the church, taught her to keep herself, and warned her about men, especially rich men from the city. But now, all those efforts, all her prayers, felt wasted. She saw her daughter's pregnancy not as a tragedy, but as a betrayal. By evening, Ezen was sent out of the house with nothing but her small nylon bag and the clothes on her back. Her mother said she could not harbor sin and shame under her roof. Her cries fell on deaf ears. No neighbors intervened. Everyone watched in silence as she walked away, her feet bare, her eyes soaked with tears that refused to stop. With nowhere to go, she wandered through the village until she found herself sleeping at a locked shopfront. The sky had no mercy that night. The rain came down in torrents, drenching her completely. Her belly ached, her body trembled, and yet, she held on to her unborn child as if it was the only thing left that hadn't abandoned her. The next day, she tried seeking help from the local church, the very place she once led worship songs with pride. But the cold reception from the pastor and church members was worse than anything she had faced. She was told she needed deliverance, not compassion. The same people who once clapped when she sang now looked at her like a sinner unworthy of grace. Her friends from the city stopped picking her calls. Some blocked her. Others responded with one-liners, excuses about being too busy or traveling. None offered help. None remembered how much she had done for them. With a broken heart and an unborn child, Ezen made her way back to Lagos, not for a fresh start, but simply to survive. She got a job as a cleaner at a roadside salon in Ajagunle. The pay was barely enough to eat, but it gave her a roof, however small. She slept under a staircase with leaking ceilings, shared with rats and the echo of her regrets. Yet, in all the pain and rejection, Ezen did not lose hope. She began to talk to her unborn baby at night, whispering dreams into her womb, promising the child a future better than hers. Even though life had turned its back on her, she held on to one thing, the belief that her story wasn't over. What she didn't know was that life had a strange way of circling back, and the man who had left her in the shadows would soon become the very person begging to bring her into the light. Lagos had a strange way of reminding people of their place, especially on rainy days. The sky turned gray without warning, and before long, the city was drenched in a flood of chaos. People ran in every direction, shielding themselves with folders, polythene bags, and worn-out umbrellas. Cars honked impatiently, okadas splashed muddy water, and gutters overflowed with forgotten things. But Ezen stood still in the middle of it all. She was heavily pregnant, soaked to the bone, with one hand clutching a nylon bag that held the last of her belongings. Her hair clung to her face, her wrapper was drenched, and her feet, bare and swollen, stood in a puddle of cold water. The rain didn't just fall on her, it consumed her, washing away whatever dignity she had left. Passers-by avoided her. No one offered shelter. No one asked questions. She was invisible, just another poor, pregnant woman in a city that had no space for broken dreams. Her body trembled from the cold, but her eyes remained blank, lifeless, staring into nothing. At that moment, a sleek black Range Rover slowly cruised past. It wasn't just a car, it was a moving declaration of wealth and status. Inside it, shielded from the chaos outside, sat Chaka, the billionaire, the man she had met 3 years ago during a painful night that changed her life forever. He was dressed in a tailored suit, scrolling through emails on his iPad, barely noticing the world around him. He wasn't a cruel man, just detached. Focused. His life was about figures, contracts, and legacy. But something pulled his eyes to the window. There, through the fogged glass, he saw her, a pregnant woman standing alone in the middle of a storm, drenched, barefoot, and trembling. For reasons he couldn't explain, his chest tightened. He kept staring, trying to place her face. There was something about her that felt familiar. Not her clothes, not her posture, but her eyes. Eyes that looked like they had known betrayal. Eyes that seemed to call out to something buried deep in him. The car slowed to a stop. People watched with confusion as the car door opened and the billionaire stepped out into the rain. He held an umbrella but didn't seem to care about the downpour. His polished shoes splashed through puddles as he walked toward the helpless woman. Ezen saw him before he saw her properly. She froze. The man from her past. The man who vanished after one unforgettable night. The man whose face had haunted her dreams and nightmares. Now, here he was, rich, powerful, dry and clean. Reaching out to offer help, completely unaware that the woman he wanted to save was the same woman he had once left behind without a word. She wanted to scream. She wanted to run. She wanted to tell him who she was. But her body was weak. Her voice was lost. And in that moment, she was too tired to fight. She allowed him to help her into the car. Inside, warmth embraced her. The scent of leather, perfume, and comfort reminded her of the world that had once destroyed her. She sat silently, water dripping from her clothes onto the expensive floor mats, as the billionaire asked no personal questions, just instructed his driver to head home. She looked out the window as the city blurred past, the rain distorting everything, people, traffic lights, and the very memory of who she used to be. In that car, Ezen carried 1,000 thoughts. She was inches away from the man who had unknowingly rewritten her life. Yet he sat beside her as if she was just another stranger rescued from the rain. But fate doesn't make such encounters for no reason. And though Chaka didn't know it yet, his world was about to change. Because the woman he had forgotten had never forgotten him. The rain had not stopped by the time they reached the mansion. It was a grand house tucked away in the heart of Lekki, the kind of place people only saw in movies or on Instagram posts they couldn't afford to like. Towering gates opened to reveal a wide compound paved with marble stones that glistened under the rain. Well-trimmed flowers lined the driveway. Every window glowed with warm light, untouched by the chaos outside. As the Range Rover pulled in, Ezen sat still, clutching her soaked bag tightly to her chest. Her mind spun, trying to process everything. She was inside the car of the very man who had unknowingly broken her and left her to bear life's burden alone. But he didn't recognize her. Not a flicker of memory crossed his face. To him, she was just a pitiful stranger rescued from a storm. The door was opened for her. She stepped out cautiously, her legs weak, her dress clinging uncomfortably to her body. The mansion towered above her like a palace, far removed from the one room she used to sleep in, under a leaking staircase with rodents for neighbors. Inside, warmth welcomed her. A maid appeared, young, polite, and surprised to see someone like Ezen in that state. She was quickly led into a guest room that smelled of lavender and lemon-scented air freshener. The bedding was clean and soft, the walls painted a gentle cream. On the wall was a portrait of Checker, standing tall and confident, his arms crossed like a man in charge of empires. Esin stood frozen for a moment, her eyes locked on his photograph. It was strange, almost surreal, to be inside the home of the man who had disappeared like smoke after one reckless night. The same night that had redefined her future, stolen her innocence, and silenced her dreams. The maid returned with warm towels, a dry nightdress, and a plate of food she could barely eat. Her stomach was unsettled, not from hunger, but from emotion. She hadn't sat at a proper dining table in almost 2 years. Now she was here, fed like royalty, lying on clean sheets, in a home she never imagined. But the walls felt too clean, too quiet, too full of memories that weren't hers. Later that night, after everyone had gone to bed, Esin couldn't sleep. She sat by the large window, watching raindrops race down the glass. Her hands rested gently on her belly. The baby was calm now, as if sensing the storm outside had passed, but the one inside her hadn't. She began to whisper to her unborn child, not words of comfort, but questions. Why now? Why him? Why here? Was this a coincidence or fate's cruel game? She wondered what kind of man Checker had become. She remembered the confident, flirtatious businessman who had wooed her with wine and soft words, only to vanish by morning. Now he seemed different, calm, quiet, almost kind. But people like him always knew how to wear masks. She didn't trust him. She couldn't. Not yet. Not when he didn't even know the truth. The truth that the child she carried, the one she had fought to protect, the one she had been thrown out for, was his. But how do you tell a man who doesn't even recognize you that he is the father of your child? How do you reveal such a heavy truth in a house this silent? And what would happen when he finally remembered? Would he be sorry? Would he believe her? Or would he turn his back again? This time with more power, more pride, and more to lose? Esin curled up on the edge of the bed, unable to answer any of those questions. The room was beautiful, the sheets soft, but her heart was restless. Beneath the roof of the man who once left her in the dark, she fell asleep, not in peace, but in pause, waiting for a moment that would soon change everything. The morning came slowly, with golden streaks of sunlight filtering through the curtains of the guest room. Esin stirred awake, confused at first. The softness beneath her was unfamiliar. The scent in the room, fresh linen and quiet luxury, reminded her that she was no longer on the hard floor of a salon storeroom, or beneath a leaking roof. She was in his house. Her eyes landed on a tray of warm breakfast placed gently at the bedside. A folded note lay next to the plate, polite, considerate, but unsigned. It felt like something from a dream. But it wasn't kindness that stirred her heart. It was the heavy truth still buried in her chest. A truth that could shatter the fragile silence between her past and his present. Hours passed, and the house hummed softly with life. She saw glimpses of staff moving about, all dressed in neat uniforms and walking with practiced grace. No one asked questions. No one looked at her with judgment. But the stillness of their stares reminded her she did not belong here. Then she heard his voice. Deep, calm, close. It came from a nearby study, muffled by the half-open door. His tone was measured, his words articulate. The voice of a man who was used to commanding attention. She stood outside the door, frozen, her heart racing. She couldn't bring herself to face him. Not yet. Not with this secret between them. Later that evening, after dinner she could barely eat, Esin stood by the hallway window overlooking the quiet garden. The house was silent again. Only the wind rustled through the flowers. She placed a hand on her belly and closed her eyes. She began to pray. Not loudly. Not with desperation. Just a soft, whispered plea to a God who had watched her through all seasons, from the shame of rejection to the stillness of this strange home. She prayed for strength. For her child. For the courage to forgive. She didn't know that she was being watched. From the top of the staircase, Checker stood in the shadows. He hadn't meant to eavesdrop, but her voice reached him like a soft wind. Something about her posture, the way she held her belly, the quiet strength in her words, it triggered something buried deep in him. A memory. A hotel room. A quiet girl in a modest dress. A night blurred by alcohol and impulse. A face he had dismissed, but that now refused to leave his mind. He walked back to his room and searched his memory like a man chasing ghosts. The next morning, he ordered his driver to run a background check. He didn't know why. He told himself it was precaution. But in truth, it was instinct. Something about the woman he rescued from the rain was too familiar. Too silent. Too close. What he discovered shattered him. Her name. Her story. The scandal in the village. The abandoned pregnancy. The single night they shared. The very child he never knew existed. He sat in his study, frozen. His entire world tilted. The woman sleeping in his guest room was not a stranger. She was the mother of his child. And he had walked away from her without a trace, never looking back. Guilt consumed him like a fire he couldn't put out. All the luxury, all the power, all the money. None of it could undo what he had done. And yet, there she was, not accusing, not bitter, not even demanding answers. Just quiet. Just present. Just trying to survive. The truth had finally found him. And nothing in his life would remain the same. The air inside the mansion had shifted. It was no longer just quiet. It was heavy, charged. Like the moment before a storm, when the sky darkens and birds disappear. Every sound echoed louder. Every breath felt like a weight. And though neither of them had spoken the truth aloud, it was already standing between them, waiting to be faced. Cheka avoided her all day. He couldn't look her in the eyes. Not now that he knew who she really was. He had uncovered everything. The truth behind her silent eyes, her painful past, the betrayal she had carried alone. The child in her womb was his. And she had said nothing. Not a word. Not a demand. Not a threat. Just silence. That silence tormented him more than if she had screamed. It forced him to confront a version of himself he had long buried. A selfish, careless man who had walked away without considering the consequences. A man who had ruined a girl's life with one night of thoughtless pleasure. A man who had created a child and disappeared before the first heartbeat. He sat in his study for hours, staring at his hands, wondering how he could possibly fix what had already been broken beyond repair. And across the hallway, in her room, Ezen felt the same storm building inside her. She knew he had found out. She saw it in the way he couldn't meet her eyes at breakfast, the way his voice trembled slightly when he told the maid to serve her food. She saw it in the way the staff avoided lingering near her door. The air was tense. Expectant. She didn't sleep that night. Instead, she sat by the window again, watching the stars, wondering if her baby would ever know a life free of shame. Wondering if Cheka would now chase her away like everyone else. Or worse, offer money like she was a problem to be solved, not a human being who had carried pain and life together. By morning, the knock came. Not forceful. Not urgent. Just deliberate. She stood, wrapped her scarf around her shoulders, and opened the door. He was standing there, quiet, unsure of himself for the first time in years. The billionaire who commanded boardrooms now looked like a lost boy seeking answers. He led her to the study. The same room where her name had been uncovered. Where her truth had been confirmed. Where his heart had finally been pierced. They sat in silence for what felt like a lifetime. There were no tears. No raised voices. Just stillness. And then, the weight of unspoken words finally gave way. Everything she had buried came to the surface, not through accusation, but through vulnerability. The pain of being discarded. The loneliness of pregnancy. The humiliation from her village. The rejection from her mother. The night she nearly took her life, standing at the edge of the bridge, belly heavy, soul empty. She didn't ask him why he left. She already knew the answer. He never thought twice. But what she needed now wasn't an apology, it was honesty. And what he needed was forgiveness. When he finally spoke, his voice broke. Not from pride, but from guilt. Not from fear, but from realization. He told her how ashamed he was. How much of his life he had wasted chasing things that never mattered. How this child, the one he didn't plan for, was the first real thing he had created. And then came the moment. Not a promise. Not a proposal. But a quiet request. To let him be present. To try. To earn trust back slowly, not with money or gifts, but with actions. Esin didn't respond immediately. She just looked at him. And for the first time in years, he looked back, not as a man above her, but as a man broken by her truth. It was not forgiveness. But it was the beginning of something close. The days that followed moved slowly, not with tension, but with unspoken change. Something had shifted between them. The air was no longer thick with secrecy, but it was still delicate, like walking barefoot on glass. Every movement was cautious. Every word, intentional. There were no dramatic confrontations, no sudden declarations of love. Just quiet gestures that tried to patch what years of silence had torn apart. Cheka became a shadow in his own home, not because he was avoiding her, but because he was watching her. Observing. Learning. For the first time, he was no longer a man consumed with control. He didn't try to force his way into her trust. He simply waited. And Esin? She was torn. Part of her wanted to run. Far away. To disappear with her child before the world saw her as a charity case rescued by guilt. But another part, the tired, weary part of her, longed to rest. Longed to breathe in a space where she wasn't judged by her scars. And though her heart still carried the weight of betrayal, she couldn't ignore what she saw in his eyes. Remorse. Real, tangible remorse. Not pity. Not manipulation. But the regret of a man who finally understood what he had lost, and what he could still save. Each morning, he left soft things at her door. Books. Fruits. Herbal tea. A pair of new sandals in her size. Nothing loud. Nothing flashy. Just small acknowledgments of her presence. Silent apologies, delivered with restraint. He didn't ask to touch her. Didn't try to hold her hand. Didn't pretend like time could undo what he'd done. Instead, he offered space. And strangely, it was in that space that Esin began to see him differently. She watched him from afar, the way he carried himself with grace in meetings, the way he spoke kindly to his staff, the way he sat alone in the garden for hours, sometimes holding a photo of his late mother. Beneath the wealth, the sharp suits, and the commanding presence, there was a man still searching for something he hadn't yet earned. Peace. And then came the day he asked to accompany her to the clinic. He didn't ask with entitlement. He asked like a student unsure if he'd passed a test. And she said yes. Not because she had forgiven him completely, but because somewhere deep inside her, a wall had begun to crack. At the clinic, he held the hospital file with a trembling hand. The doctor addressed them as a couple, and for the first time, Esin didn't correct it. She lay on the bed while the ultrasound began. The heartbeat of the child echoed in the small room. Fast, strong, alive. Cheka's eyes welled. He didn't speak. He didn't have to. Everything he wanted to say was in the way he held his breath. In the way his hand reached slowly for hers but stopped just short. Asking, not assuming. She didn't pull away. Not yet. But she also didn't hold him back. Because this wasn't a fairy tale. This was still healing, still unfolding, still real. Back at the mansion, he didn't follow her inside. He remained by the gate, hands in his pockets, watching her walk up the steps slowly, her back straight, her belly leading. For the first time, he didn't see her as the girl from Enugu who stumbled into his life. He saw her as a woman, carrying not just his child, but a strength he would spend a lifetime trying to deserve. It wasn't a reunion. It wasn't a resolution. It was something softer. A beginning. Months passed. The rain had long stopped. The clouds had cleared, both in the sky and in their lives. What once felt impossible had slowly, tenderly begun to take shape. Not perfectly. Not without moments of hesitation. But with sincerity. Esin had changed. Not just in her body, as her belly stretched with new life, but in her spirit. The girl who once wept alone at bus stops and slept beneath staircases was gone. In her place stood a woman who had walked through shame and come out unbroken. A woman who had been silenced by life but found the strength to speak through her choices. And Chaka, the once untouchable billionaire, the man who lived behind gates and beneath luxury, had changed too. He no longer walked like someone trying to own the world. He walked like someone trying to rebuild one. One that could hold space for the child he had almost never known, and the woman he had almost lost. He didn't force his way into her heart. Instead, he built a path and waited for her to walk it, on her own terms. And slowly, she did. They talked more often now. Real conversations. Not about the past, but about the future. About co-parenting. About names. About what kind of father he wanted to be. What kind of mother she had become. He asked questions. He listened when she answered. Trust, once shattered, was being rebuilt, brick by brick. Then came the day they traveled back to her village. Not in shame, but in restoration. The same dusty roads that once carried her home in disgrace now welcomed her with whispers of awe. The people who had mocked her now watched in silence as she stepped out of the car, graceful, glowing with purpose and dignity. She was no longer the girl who had returned pregnant and alone. She was the woman whose story had refused to end in shame. Chaka didn't come with bodyguards or pride. He came with humility. He stood before her mother, before the elders, and bowed his head. He asked for forgiveness, not with grand speeches, but with honest words and quiet remorse. And the mother who once threw her daughter out, who had been broken by disappointment and stained by gossip, looked at him, then at her daughter, then at the child forming in her womb. And she wept. Not from pain, but from relief. Because her daughter had survived. Because grace had found them. Because healing had finally come full circle. A small naming ceremony was held. It wasn't loud. It wasn't extravagant. Just a quiet gathering beneath the mango tree in the compound. Women sang. Children danced. The baby, now in Ezin's arms, yawned as if life had never been hard. Cheka held his daughter for the first time with trembling hands. The same hands that had once let go of everything that mattered. Now, they held the future. And as Ezin watched him, something softened in her. She didn't see the man who left her anymore. She saw the man who returned. Not with promises, but with presence. He didn't ask her to marry him that day. He didn't need to, because the beginning they were building was no longer about romance or apology. It was about redemption. About raising a child not in fear, but in love. About honoring the journey that had brought them here, through storms, through silence, through scars. And as they stood beneath the sky that once wept over them, now blue and full of light, Ezin smiled. Not because everything was perfect, but because she had found peace. At last.